Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Grace of a Military Child in Life podcast. Military families are not like your traditional family. They are strong, brave, resilient, and some of the most incredible people I know. My name is Gracie, a U.S. Army brat, and I am your host. I am honored to be able to give military family members like myself a place for them to share their stories and experiences in the military life. Stay tuned for this week's guest. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to a new episode of Grace of a Military Child in Life. Today, I'm here with Christa, who is both a military child and now a military spouse. So, Christa, welcome to the podcast. How are you?
Thank you. I'm good. Doing well.
Awesome. Yes. So, tell us what it's like, growing up as a military child and kind of transitioning into that role as a spouse as well.
Yeah, for sure. I want to preface to say that I definitely did not probably get the most normal military child experience. I am the youngest of four, and there is a 6-year age gap between me and my closest sister. So my 3 older siblings got way more of the typical moving all the time, going to like 4 different high schools. And I just had like the last bit of it. So a lot of the moving was done when I was a baby. I was born in Nebraska, and 2 months later, we moved to Korea for 2 years. And I pretend I have memories from that time frame, but mostly it's just like photos and stories my family has told me. So they're always like, "You don't remember that?" And I'm like, "Well,
at least you can say you've lived there."
Yeah, I was like, that was the most exciting place we lived. Like, let me
let me pretend.
I know some military kids who had dual citizenship. But I never got that. So it's been cool to have that. But yeah. And then we moved to Texas. We were in San Antonio for about 5 years. And so that was the primary move. I remember when I was about 7, I think we moved to Virginia. And my dad was in Virginia for a bit. And then a lot of my older siblings, 2 of them had started college. And so he had hit 29 years at that point, and had just done a deployment. And they were kind of looking at like, he was a colonel at the time. And so they were like, okay, if you want to continue on and kind of hit that next career marker, they were like, we're going to deploy you again and move you. And so my parents felt pretty strongly that they wanted to stay in the state that most of my siblings were going to college and just kind of retire. So I think, oh gosh, when did my dad retire? I don't remember how old I was, but after age 7, it was pretty stable for me. We never moved again. And so I would say I got pretty close to like a normal childhood. But I also kind of took in all of like my siblings' experiences and just kind of how my family operated. I think military families, there's just like a different approach to like meeting people and making new friends and building community. And so my family operated like that. And so I kind of got some of that experience without having to move around. I still went to like 3 different types of schools, just because my family kind of did like the homeschooling thing and then did the private school, did the public school. So I think, again, that's a little bit military style of like everywhere you live, the school system's very different. And so a little bit more fluidity with like, there's not just like one type we pick, because everywhere you go, you're going to have different options, and they're going to be good and they're going to be bad. And you have to kind of pick what you think is best in each place. So I got that. And then my brother is also in the military, and he's been in for about 12 to 13 years, I think, and is married, and they have 3 kids. So I'm really close with them. And so I also kind of just take in like their experience and what they're going through and all of that as well. So that's kind of the overview of like my military childhood, which again, I like to say is very different than probably your average military kid. But I'm grateful to have been able to have like the benefits of kind of what's taught to military kids of like how to kind of be flexible and pick up your life and make new friends and go to new schools and just be very adaptable, while also having the stability, which I'm so grateful for as well. So I've kind of gotten like a mixed bag of it as well.
Yeah. I think mine was, we were a reserve family too. So,
Yeah.
and my dad's service was very kind of choppy throughout my childhood. Like he did a lot of his service right out of high school before, he met my mom,
Okay.
before he had kids. And so he had a lot of that done. And then he got out. It was like right after September 11th, my parents got married, like 4 days after, completely planned. And then my mom was pregnant with me. And then my sister was born 15 months after me.
Mm-hmm.
And my dad had been on 2 deployments in that time. So it's like he got married, had 2 kids, and been on 2 deployments in two
Yeah.
years. So like 2.5 years. And so he was like, okay, I'm like, I've grown a family and have not been there for my family. So
Yeah.
he got out and then he got back in 7 years later. So as a
Wow.
young child, he got back in and then he deployed, he got injured, we moved, and then he recovered and he couldn't continue serving. So then he retired and we moved again. So like every experience is so different. But I
Yeah.
think too, like you were saying, you grow up in a family with military experience,
Mm-hmm.
is you get those values instilled in you, even if you were not around for much of the military service too.
Yeah. Yeah. And even I think it, regardless of like how long you've been in or your parents have been in, yeah, I think just being around that world. And again, you absorb so much of other people's experiences too. I think as well, there's like that
Right?
camaraderie of like, well, what have you been through? What have I been through? And so I feel like there's almost like this shared knowledge, even if you might not have been, like had
Yeah.
like a very traditional. But even I grew up in a huge military community. I mean, Chesapeake, Virginia Beach, Norfolk,
Yes.
Hampton Roads
Huge.
area is like massive military community and retired military community. And so, and even meeting other military kids, it looked so different. And there would be times where I'd be like, we're not the same. It can be so unique and that
Yes.
like, because every service, and then you add in branches and like my dad was in the Air Force, my brother's in the Coast Guard, and now my husband's in the Army. And it's like whiplash
All
of
around.
like, yeah, it's like, oh, one branch does this. Oh, nope. This other doesn't do this. Or it's
Right.
even that's hard to get like support because they're like, well, we don't know what the Army does. And I'm like, yeah.
Yeah, it's different. Even, down to the enlistment process, going through that now myself, it's like,
Yeah.
wow. So it's one big army or one big military. You'd think like each branch is very similar, and which they are very, very similar, but they each have their own little things that's so different. And then, you start going through the process and start figuring things out, and you start talking with other people, and you're like, okay, well, this is why I'm going through. And they're like, well, we did it in this branch and it is not the same. And then acronyms are different,
Oh my gosh, yes.
So yeah, all around it is such a different world depending on which branch you get into.
It is. My husband was originally going Marines, OCS, and they potentially have a different term, but uh, and then switched over to Army because of just the uniqueness of the Marines process. And then COVID really like
Oh, yes.
extrapolated that to like the extreme. And then I think just the longer you're in, you kind of start to learn more, like you said, about the nuances of each branch and how there really are differences. And you do kind of have to view it like a career in the sense of like, okay, I have to figure out what I want from each branch. And like that's going to
Right.
look really different based on kind of what I want to do. How'd you settle on the Army? Or are you doing
So
Army? I just
I
assumed
am
that.
doing Army.
Okay.
I am going Army. My dad was Army. And
Okay.
so when when I kind of said that I wanted to join and I was looking at it, because, coming out of college, even that I have a master's degree, everyone's like, well, we want experience. You can't just come to, these level of positions with no experience. I'm like, well, I need experience and you're not giving me experience. So even for entry level jobs.
Mhm.
So it's definitely hard finding a career. And so, I started entertaining the idea of military. And at first everyone was like, go Air Force or Space Force. Like, do not join any other branch. Go Air Force or Space Force. You are going to enjoy your life so much more.
Yeah.
And so that's the route I was going. But again, their process is so different. And it's hard to get into talk with an officer recruiter, and the officer recruiters are 3 hours away from me. So everything was done virtually, and, it's just hard. And so my dad started just calling some of his friends, and we were like, can you at least give her advice of what to do? Even Army versus Air Force, which is what I was going for. And, they just started giving me advice. And then, we start talking to people, and they're like, well, you can do this, and we'll put you in contact with this person and this person and this person. And next thing I know, I was talking to an Army recruiter, filling out the paperwork. So, it all worked out, and it's funny kind of seeing how full circle it's becoming. And, my dad joined under the Army where the motto was "Be all you can be." And then, through the years, we've changed Army of One, Army Strong, and now we're back to "Be all you can be." So we were both enlisting under the same motto. And
Very
then,
cool.
Dates are just aligning. I was in the recruiter's office with him on his birthday. So crazy things. But Army, I like the Army a lot more too. And again, because I'm so used to it from growing up with it, it's a little easier of a transition. Because even with the Air Force, like, they call it OTS, Officer Training School, and then OCS in the Army. So little things like that are different.
Did you ever think you'd join the military after growing up?
That's like a loaded question, because if you would have asked a 9-year-old me when we were going through like his recovery and stuff, and just seeing, because in San Antonio, I'm sure you saw it too, from the little you may remember living there, there's so many injured that come through. And so just seeing, the burn victims, the amputations, everything going through that time, I was like, not going in the military myself, not marrying into it, doing nothing. And then throughout life, I kept going, okay, well, but what if I did join? Like, I wanted to go to West Point at one point. I wanted to join after the pullout of Afghanistan. I wanted to, my ex was a Marine. And then, I got so used to kind of that idea of that lifestyle that I would be living. And then I was like, okay, well, we're not together anymore. And I still want the lifestyle. So I'm just going to join myself. And then, like I said, coming out of college, it's hard to get a job. So I was like, why not? It's been in the back of my head since like sophomore year of high school. So I guess we should just like entertain the idea and go for it now.
Yeah, I think that is such a shared, well, and this is presuming, but I feel like it's a shared experience among like military children of like, I'm never going to have anything to do. I escaped. I did my time. Like and I didn't have a choice. And so like, I'm out. I'm not going to marry anyone. I was talking to a retired military family here where we're at. And she was saying how her oldest daughter was like, I'm never marrying anyone in the military. And her mom's like, famous last words, because we literally live around one of the largest military bases. So you're bound to meet someone. But yeah, I think that's so common of just like I had a very similar experience of like, nope, I'm done. Like, we're not doing this.
I always say we see both the good sides and the bad sides of the life. And sometimes we let those bad things, those negative experiences outweigh the good things. And if you really strip the life down to, the little amazing things that it is, then you'll see so many incredible things that come from this, like the community, getting to move. Maybe you'll get back to be able to go back to South Korea and actually remember it now. So many things that come from it, but we let those things that are hard, the deployments and the trainings, and yes, they are hard, but if you don't let it outweigh the positives that come with the life, then, I think military kids are, we're just drawn to the military in some sort of way, whether you want to acknowledge it or not. You'll find a way back to it most of the time.
Yeah, I think it's that sense of like familiarity, regardless of whether you want it to be like or not. It's that like, just it's a piece of you. Like when I got my new military ID from when
Yeah.
from the one when I had through college expired and I had to get a new one as a spouse, it was like there's a sense of like, no, this is right. Like this
Yeah.
feels right. And I mean, so many other things. Hard. But that was weird how like normal that felt to just like go get my ID because I had gone so many times with my dad to renew it. And like that was just like something we did together. And so it felt normal, even though for most people that's like not, it's a random
Yeah.
little thing. But as a kid, it felt like I was so proud to always have my military ID. I never had a credit card, like you don't have these things,
Yes.
you have your military ID.
Yes.
And so that was a funny little thing I didn't realize to be meaningful or would be meaningful. And then it was, and I was like, oh, cool.
Well, and it's literally, it sounds crazy to say it, but your life is literally that little piece of plastic. Because
Mm-hmm.
if you live on base, you can't go home without it. Or, your parent bringing you on.
Mm-hmm.
That's like your medical insurance card. Like literally everything is in
Yeah.
that card.
Yeah.
And,
And you
you
have it
don't,
before people typically have a driver's license. So it's like
yes.
you've just had this with you for so long.
Yeah, my friends and I have called it like a little VIP card, But that's literally the hardest thing. You start getting to these college years and you're like, okay, well, what am I going to do? Because it feels like, giving up the ID card, it's like giving up part of your life.
Yeah.
As, at the same time, you can't just go on base and go to the commissary or the PX or
Yeah.
whatever, you normally do on base, maybe a restaurant or something. But then, you get to the point where you're like, okay, I'm a spouse now or I'm joining myself. Like you get that back and it
Mm-hmm.
really is a freeing feeling. When I can imagine for myself, it'll be like a freeing feeling to be like, okay, now this is, it keeps going. You don't have to end it there.
Yeah. It's hard. It's hard when it's two different identities almost, and you
Yes.
like age out of one
Right.
it's kind of a hard place to be as a military kid. Yeah.
Yeah. What was that transition into a spouse like?
Yeah. I also was like, I'm never going to marry anyone in the military. And having seen my brother join, that added to
Yeah.
it, just like, everything he was going through and that our family was going through with him, just supporting him. I was like, no, we're good.
Yeah.
And I met my husband in college, and he kind of knew he always wanted to do the military, but his parents really wanted him to go to college. And he ended up enjoying it and sticking it out for the 4 years. And so we met there. And it wasn't until towards the end when he started to get like really serious, like I'm going to join the military. And I was like, it always felt like, oh, good one, like whatever,
Funny story.
yeah, not a big deal. And then I think it was early COVID when he's like, hey, I've applied, like this is happening. And I started like having all of these anxiety attacks, panic attacks, whichever one category you want to put them in. And I was like, no, I cannot do this. Like, I can't go down this road again. And it was really hard because it was like this future I envisioned for my life was like, I either have to choose to marry the person I want and feel like I should marry, or like I choose not to because I don't want to go down the military road. And so it felt like this impossible choice of like, I don't want the military lifestyle at that point in time. And like, but I want to marry this person. And I really had to process a lot of that. I didn't realize how much growing up I had used the military as a coping mechanism for just things my family experienced. And I would say, like, oh, well, like, we have this sort of relationship with our extended family because of the military, or like so many things that I would just say. And again, I didn't really have the direct experience, but both my siblings' stories and my mom's stories of just like military life and like the hard things she went through, those stick with you, like you said, more than the good things she experienced. And so I didn't realize how much I had internalized my mom's experience, to just like the way my family operated, I was just like, that's the military's fault. Like, blame everything on the military when it wasn't. It was just an easy like scapegoat and coping mechanism in my mind as like a kid growing up. And so it wasn't until I was faced with like, okay, the person I want to marry is joining the military. And I began to be like, oh, this is all just going to happen to me over again. When in reality, it's like, no, but it took like counseling and time and all of that to really unravel a lot of what I had internalized growing up as a military child and was just had never processed through and was like, I can't do this again. Like my way of coping was to get out and to be like, distance myself from the military as much as possible. And now I'm getting like roped back in.
Don't you just love how life works out like that?
I know. Yeah. Like forcing you to really like come to terms with your child.
Right?
Yeah, which is good, you know, but it's hard for sure. And I could have just ran away from it, but felt really strongly like he was the person I was meant to marry. And again, just like counseling and stuff like that was so good to be able to just talk through and really begin to realize that we have so much control over how we show up in like the lives of our children, our family, our extended family, our friends. And even I think someone like serving too, it's like I have an aspect of control over like my service and like what that means for like me and my future family. And that is the piece that I never really focused on. It was like everything's out of control. Everything's happening to me. And I think as a kid, that kind of can just happen. And so as an adult, I was like, round two, here we go. Everything's just going to happen to me and I don't have control or a choice. And I really had to start like reframing that in my head of like my husband's service, our family's time in the military is going to look so different than my parents, than my brothers. And that is because we are one, different people, and two, we're choosing to show up in a way that like fits with how we want to raise our kids, how we want to, you know, live into our marriage, like all of those things that we have these like family goals and ideals and whatnot. And yes, the military owns some of that, like the control of where we go and when we go and that stuff. But that doesn't mean we lose autonomy over our lives. So I kind of had to get to that place very early on, but it didn't, again, it all still is like ethereal when it's like, I've applied and I'm waiting for the board to review. I'm waiting for my date too.
And it's a long process.
Yeah. And my husband, it was like 2 years for him because he first went through the Marines for like multiple times. They allow you to apply for the Marine officer school. And so he did that multiple times. Whereas the Army, I think it's like one application, like you apply to OCS like once. And I think you can potentially petition for a second round, but there was just a more seriousness when he did like Army of like, okay, this is going to be like and that was a way longer process because that was like a year application for him.
Right. You got to wait. Like I got lucky and hit it at the perfect time that there is a board coming up. But if you don't, then you have to wait until the next board.
And they're not frequent.
No, once a quarter. That's it.
Yeah. So, and then COVID and right after COVID was also just like crazy pants because they were like shrinking class sizes all over the place. And so, so that again, all felt like, oh, haha, good one. Like, you know, yes, it's happening. And yes, I've agreed and I've married you, but it still didn't feel super real. And then he went to basic last August. And that's when it was like, okay,
this is really happening.
Yeah. This is a little bit real. And so he was gone for 8 months, which is 2 months longer than the process like typically takes, because when he, both when he got to basic, there was a historic delay. And so they like held him in processing or whatever you want to call it for like 3 weeks. And that's like was unheard of at that time. And so that made him miss his OCS start date. And they were just, military life things, wouldn't
Right.
pluck the OCS people out to like start them earlier. They just like let them go with everyone else when their group was like selected to start basic. Um, and so, yeah, that made him miss his OCS start date by like 3 days, something insane,
Wow. That sucks.
which then made him have to sit at OCS in, there's like hold over, hold under. I don't know the difference. Anyway, sit
One or
like,
the other.
yeah, had to sit for 2 months doing nothing.
Wow.
So
Yeah.
that was like super discouraging because for me as a spouse, because you have this like 6 month time frame and you're like, okay, I can get through 6 months. You start to like just kind of plan out the 6 months and be like, all right, we've got this. And then you get, like 3.5 months in or whatever. And I was like, okay, like we're moving forward finally after he sat for 3 weeks, but it's happening. And then you find out like, oh, they're adding 2 months of just nothing onto this. And so that was really hard. It felt like a second wall in the process of like, oh, the past 2 months have been worthless. For me, it felt that way, even though they weren't. Because then it was like, oh, the OCS clock isn't starting for 2 more months. And so that was a hard mental hurdle to kind of overcome.
Well, and you're not even moving there. So
Yeah.
like you're just sitting,
Mm-hmm.
around at home doing nothing, just
Yeah.
like you said, waiting for that clock to start.
And that was the hard thing. It was both really awesome that I was still in the place where we had like built our community and had gone to college. And so I had great friendships and I had my job and all of that stuff. So, but it was weird because it was like nothing had changed for me, but at the same time, everything had changed. And this decision my husband made is going, or that we made together, is now going to change the future of my life
And you're like
significantly.
simultaneously prepping for, everything to change because you're going to move again,
Yeah.
or soon, you're going to, all those childhood things start coming back of, okay, this is just going to, dominoes falling over. And so you're doing all of that, but you're still trying to live a normal life at the same time, knowing it's not normal.
Yeah. It was super disillusioning. I like my body didn't know what it was like. Are things normal or are they not? And it was like, yes,
Right.
and no, like, yes, nothing physically has changed, but also my husband's gone and I can't talk to him. And like, I feel like my whole world has changed, but no one I'm around sees that. And so that was really hard place of like, it felt like an identity crisis of like, I'm parading like everything's normal and fine, except internally I'm like dying. So, this really crazy period of time. And it's hard on my husband too. And I think for anyone who has a significant other or a spouse that goes through that, basic and OCS, it's hard because you have this other world that's outside. And typically those things are meant to be fully all consuming. Like you give all your mental focus. You're not thinking about family and you're not thinking about the outside world. You're in your like training bubble. But as a husband, or even I would say as a partner too, you do still have a life outside of there. You can't just be like, my spouse doesn't exist or my friend or whatever doesn't exist. And that was really hard on my husband too, because it was this hard balance of like, how much do I now have to juggle these two realities for myself too? Like I'm still a husband, I still have my wife, but this is all consuming and they're telling me to make it all consuming and to completely like forget the world exists, but it doesn't. And I'm still responsible to a human being who wants to know like how I'm doing. And so that was hard. And I think maybe parents feel that way a little bit too, like when their kids go to basic or OCS. But as a spouse, that was tricky too, of like, what does it look like to be married to someone who's like all focus is in this place at this time, but I still need like letters. I still need phone calls. Like, I still need notes, and trying to find that balance of like what's realistic for them and how can I learn to be really independent on my own and kind of self-sufficient in that way as well.
Yeah. No, and it's hard. I can imagine, just putting myself through the mindset of what it's going to be like actually being at basic training. And so I can only imagine, from both sides what it's what it's like and the challenges you go through. Because yes, basic training is going to be hard. It is meant to be hard. It is meant to, build on the foundation that you already have. It's meant to form you into, a soldier. And then, at home, you're like, okay, when am I going to hear from them? When am I going to, are they still alive? All of these random questions. And it's like, okay, well, they're not on a deployment. So that's a little, a breath of fresh air.
They should be alive. Something's gone wrong if they are.
Right. So, it's a little more comforting. But then at the same point, it's like, okay, well, are they succeeding? Are they, completing all of their, activities and courses and things like that successfully? And, you can't help but worry about those things. And so, especially, having gone through the life yourself as a child, it's like, kind of like you said earlier, it's all digging back up. And whether you like it or not, whether you want to acknowledge it or not, it's going to be there. And so you're kind of forced to deal with that second reality on top of it, of being a spouse, being, having gone through the lifestyle before, but also at the same point, knowing that it's changed and there's differences. I know now you get your phone sometime in basic training. Yeah. And then, a decade ago, you don't. So like times are changing, which is great, but then, it still poses challenges on both sides.
Yeah. And I think as a kid too, you don't fully, just like, when you become an adult and you realize bills exist and all these things of like what running a household means. It's similar in like with the military too, of like, I think, yes, like military children are astute and do pick up on like what's going on in the larger family, especially when a parent leaves and is deployed. But I still never fully understood the extent of it until becoming a military spouse. Like it's a very different reality being the spouse and being a dependent, like a kid, where it's like, okay, well, mom still got, like, it's still on mom.
Yeah.
Like, if dad's
she'll
gone,
take care of it.
Yeah, or reverse, if mom's gone, like dad's doing it. And so there's still this sense of like, oh, stuff is happening and this is weird and I don't like what's going on right now. But I can also kind of compartmentalize because I've got my other parent here who's doing that, or at least that was my reality. And then as a spouse, you don't realize just like the weight of like, even my husband's in the field this week, really minor, not a big deal. But even just like things around the apartment, I'm like, I've had to be really in tune to just like, I'll be like, oh, why is it so much harder for me to like stick to my routine when he's gone or whatnot? And it's like, okay, I need to be patient with myself because there is so much more of a weight of things on my shoulders when he's gone that you don't necessarily realize when they're around, and then they leave and you're like, oh, I'm thinking about things I kind of didn't have to think about before. So,
right. Yeah, it's definitely something, when you don't have to do it, you don't necessarily think about it. And so you just kind of keep going through, even if it's something as simple as, doing the dishes. Somebody else is always there to do it. You don't have to think about it yourself. But then that second that comes, they're gone. They're not there to do it. That's an extra thing that you have to do that takes, 15 or so minutes of your time and throws everything off. So it's like you have to create a whole different routine when they're gone versus when they're here. And then, you talk about reintegration periods and all of that too.
Yeah. And even, seeing my sister-in-law, my brother's on a phase where they're back for like 2 to 3 months and then gone for 5. And that's their kind of rotation for 2 years. And that's been really hard because it's like you get adapted and then they go, and then you get adapted to them being home and then they leave. And it's like, and you think like, oh, when they're home, it'll be a break, but it's really just them prepping for the next 5-month period. And so I think too, it's so hard in those really high tempo seasons where it's like, they're here, they're gone, they're here, they're gone. And you get a little bit of whiplash. And I feel like it's so important for military spouses and children too, like parents to children, to have that added grace in those seasons of like, this is not normal. This is not normal. And that's okay to acknowledge that. Like, it doesn't mean it's bad, but it's not normal. And my body knows that. And so I have to be so in tune with caring for myself, caring for my children well, giving us space to process all that this means. Every move is a huge life adjustment. I mean, just this past move, I had to move everything myself. They wouldn't let my husband come up and help move, even though he wasn't doing anything, which we love. So yeah, packed up our entire apartment alone and left our first apartment together alone, which was really sad. And then moved everything down here, 2 cats who had never traveled before, drove the whole way, did a ditty. So, did it myself, which is fine, and have lovely parents who obviously know how this works and are so willing to jump in and help. But then after like 2 weeks of settling in, I got like full body hives for a month. And I was like, what is happening? What is going on? But you just don't realize. And my mom said like that would happen to her after big moves, that she would have like shingles or something crazy, or the whole family would get the flu for like a super long period of just like, you don't realize the stress that your body internalizes, even if you're trying really well to manage things well and it looks great on the outside. Your body just internalized so much because it knows that this isn't necessarily normal to be going through, or to be doing it without your spouse, or to be doing it without typical support or whatever someone's going through. So yeah, I think that's the biggest thing I've learned is just like so far. And I think military kids, I think they learned this too over time of like learning to just give yourself grace and coping, because it's okay to acknowledge that this isn't normal and it's hard, while also, like you said, acknowledging all the great things that are going on and not staying in that like mental space of this is so hard and I just like hate this. Right. Place of like, oh my gosh, this is such an exciting adventure. This is so fun. Like, I love this season to be able to explore and do new things. So you really do have to balance those. And that's hard, to give space for like the hard and like really emphasize the good in the season too.
Yeah. That's why I think a lot of military families, like, growing up, my mom was like, okay, well, you can cry for like 5 minutes, but then, you have to, pick yourself up and keep going. And, from a kid's aspect, it is really hard to do that because you don't necessarily have concept of that and what's going on. So I was always the kid who cried for like a week when my dad was gone. My sister, she was like, oh, your dad gone? What? Fine, whatever. We'll just keep going with life. Still being hard, but we'll just keep going. But then, you have to have space to let it out, or else it's going to like, eat you up inside. Yeah. And so you have to let those, negative emotions, feelings, live. And, if moving's hard for you, then it'll get easier as it goes on. And it might not feel like it's getting easier, but because you can adapt to it, because you can look at the brighter side and see, oh, well, I'm getting to explore a new area of the country or the world that I never thought I would get to, or I'll meet new people. And so if you can find like those little positive things within it that, change your mindset and make you kind of, in a sense, trick yourself to feeling those, more positive emotions, then I think it makes it a little easier.
It does. Yeah. It's so important, like self-talk, like what you put in, you'll eventually believe. Right.
If you keep saying this sucks, then it's going to suck. And it's going to suck for, the entirety of your parent or spouse's career.
Yeah. Yeah. And your kids will pick up on that too. I think, I knew when things were going well and when things weren't. And even if I wasn't fully aware of why, like kids pick up on the dynamics of that. And so, yeah, what you put out there is so important for coping as well. And I think too, it's that resilience piece. I think everyone talks about that among like military children. It's just, and the family as a whole, of just that resilience of like, yeah, we can completely uproot our life and know that we're still going to be okay. And there's this really awesome like family bond that comes from it of like, we as a family unit are super tight and we know how to just be together, because so often it's just been us in a new place without like friends and relatives and all of that. And so even though my siblings and I all have different personalities, we all are very equipped at like making new friends and like talking to people. And like, that was also modeled for me growing up of like, okay, like you're going to a new school this year, suck it up. Like you're gonna
Good
make
luck.
friends. Yeah,
Yeah.
like it's naive to think you won't. Like there's people, and as an adult, I have to reiterate like what my parents told to me as a kid, as a spouse now, because it's like, okay, I'm moving to a new place. I don't know anyone and I'm trying to make friends. And it can be very easy to tell yourself, like, well, everyone already has friends. Like
Right.
everyone has friends and there's no friends left for me. And I've learned, especially where we're at now, a lot of people grow up here and stay here. And so that was even harder because I was like, oh, of course, they grew up here, their entire family's here, they've been going to church at the same church their whole life. Like they don't need friends, like they're fine. When in reality, it's like, no, someone can have a lot of people around them that they know, but they can still be very lonely. And so that's a space where I can come in and I can like treat everyone as like, in like presuming that like, okay, maybe they don't have someone in their life that they can rely on in this way. Like maybe they don't have a close friend, or maybe they don't have someone who will like go on walks with them in the morning, or maybe they don't have someone who they can call, or they can, go sit at a coffee shop with for hours. And like, I can be that friend.
Yeah.
And so not presuming like everyone's got their people and I just have to not have anyone for this season of life. Instead being like, no, like there's a lot of lonely people who know a lot of people and I can
Yeah.
be that friend to them in that way. And so I think, there's also that benefit of growing up as a military kid, becoming a military spouse, what your parents have told you to help cope. I reiterate to myself
Yeah.
now as an adult, because it's still hard. I don't think it ever gets easier to like put yourself out there and meet new people.
No. And, some people have it a little easier in themselves and their personality to,
Yeah.
put themselves out there. And some people it's a little harder. And it
Yeah.
depends on the season of life you're into, right? Like sometimes it is going to be easier and you're going to want to, meet everyone in the, your new town. And then sometimes you're like, okay, I'm just going to stay in my little bubble for a little while. But yeah, it doesn't get easier. And in some aspects, and sometimes you just have to force yourself to, in a sense, make it easier so then you can figure it out and you can keep going. And especially because not only for yourself, but then, your husband, if you have kids coming around later and,
Yeah.
things like that. Because like you said, kids pick up on that. Even animals, animals pick up on
Yeah.
it. So literally the entire family that I
Yeah.
love, I always say that we're a unit too. So I
Yeah.
love, the family unit.
Yeah, it is. It's, yeah, exactly what you said. It's just like and I've learned this, or I've had to kind of teach myself this of like, I need to know what I need to thrive in this season of
Yes.
life. And I need to put my everything into that. And that's not on my husband to make this duty station great for me. He has no control over that. And he's also working. And I'm working too. And so it's like, what brings me joy? Like, what is going to be life-giving to me at this place that we're at? And I have to invest in that, even if it feels hard. So that means reaching out to spouses on the like officer spouse page on Facebook. And that means like serving with nonprofits in the area, because that's something I love doing. And that means like, serving with the high school ministry at our church, because I love like high schoolers and I used to do that. And that was one of my favorite things I did. And so I could stay at home and be like, we are only going to be here for like 6 months to a year. We have no idea how long we'll be here. And it's just easier not to try to like put down roots. But I know I would be miserable and I would be a miserable wife because I would be miserable to my husband of like, why'd you bring me here? This sucks.
Right.
Instead, I can say like, no, I'm going to make this a place that when we leave, we're going to be sad to go. Like that is my goal, and it's hard and it's painful and I don't want to do it because I don't want to miss a place that I know I'm going to be leaving soon from. But I'm so grateful that each place I go and live, I get to meet people and invest in a community that is so unique. Like coming from DC,
Right.
Northern Virginia, to like I mean, people are going to get upset if I call this small town Georgia because it's the second largest city in Georgia, but like
It feels small town.
It's a massive culture shock. It's a very different pace of life, so different. But there is so much that I love down here that we couldn't have gotten in Northern Virginia. And so I think, yeah, like focusing on the good so hard, so intentionally, even like in basic, my husband had to do that. He was like, he's like, basic is not physical necessarily. Like it is. And they attack you physically. And like it's meant to tear your body down. But he's like, that's one thing. He's like, it's the mental. Like it is just the yelling, the tearing you down mentally, the physical and mental exhaustion of it. He's like that people break from, that people don't get through, and that people will drop out because of. And I think for even just the military lifestyle, it's like you have to stay so mentally strong. And when you're not, you have to get help. So that looks like counseling, or that looks like, if you need like medical support or whatnot, like you have to be aware of like how your body's responding, and you have to pursue being like mentally strong so well, because that is really hard, and it can be so mentally taxing, this lifestyle of like, we don't know when we're going to move. We don't know where we're going. And then you try to add in like, do I do school on top of that? Do I have kids? Like you're constantly playing these mental juggling acts, and that is just mentally exhausting. And so I think it is so important. And obviously, like you see in the military, it is not a huge thing talked about is mental health, but it's such a big part of both for service members and for family supporting them, is like staying mentally like healthy is so important.
Yeah. It's that theory that, I've been talking to so many people about recently, is that you can't pour from an empty cup. And so if your cup is not overflowing, then it's going to be harder, and it's going to be harder for you to continue to support, your spouse, your family, and, be there for yourself, because if you're not there for yourself, then it's going to be much harder.
Yeah. Which is why it's so important that there are resources for military spouses and children too, and helping them both get into schools, go to school, pursue like a life within the military. So it doesn't feel like this is your whole life and that it's all consuming, that you can still have goals and achieve them and feel really excited. Yeah. And have things that are filling your cup. Otherwise, like you said, there's a massive attrition, burnout rate, and recruitment is like not filling that void. And so it's like, we need people to stay in the military, and that also comes from supporting the families. And like a lot of bases, I think, are now realizing like we need to support these families here. Like we need to pour back into them, because we're losing people because the family is just devolving. I mean, divorce rates and all of this stuff you see, it's like, it's hard, and there's hard stuff outside the military too. Like the grass is not greener. It is hard everywhere, but I feel like there's added stuff that needs a little bit extra support in those places.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I think that, like you said, the grass is not greener on the other side, and you have to kind of realize that. And once you realize that, and you realize that, okay, you can make the best out of this. And it still be hard, but you can't necessarily just get out and it's going to be easy. Because you get out and then you're going to face different struggles and different challenges. And, not even talking about the civilian world, but then you lose the sense of community that you have within the military life, because that's not very present in the civilian world as it is the military.
It's so hard. And I don't think it's talked about a lot of like the transition the whole family goes through when the parent retires. It's jarring. It's hard.
It is.
Even just like my dad retiring, like he had a massive identity crisis. Like, it's like, what do I do now? And it's hard to be like, I've done this one thing for 29 years and it ruled my life. It told me what to dress, what to wear, like everything. And my dad was one of those people that loved that. And so he felt a lot of security in that. And then you go and it's like, okay, what, like now I can,
what's next?
Yeah. Like now I'm in control, but I don't know what that looks like.
I don't like being in control now.
Yeah. And it's hard. It's a really hard place to say, okay, now I need to commit myself to a second career. What does that look like? And I think the whole family feels that of like, oh, okay, like what do we do? What do we do now? Um, people being like, oh, where are you from? And you're like, have to kind of be like, well, I'm not in the military anymore, but I was, and I was raised and I live, blah, 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 blah,
Yeah.
all these places. And it's an identity shift for sure.
Yeah. Even like we were talking about earlier with ID cards, it really is an identity. You feel like you lose who you are, and you have to relearn that and refind it. And it is not the easiest process to go through.
No, for the longest time, I tried to use my ID card after it expired. And certain places would let you, but one of the places I tried it in Northern Virginia was at like a state park or whatever, and they were like, they were like, oh, it has to not be expired, and your like sponsor parent has to be like active duty, and so I was like, oh, both are wrong, but most people don't know how to read the ID card.
Yeah.
So they don't know it's a retired ID card, and they don't usually check the date. Right. And the lady, she was like a park ranger, and she was like, this is expired and your parent is retired. She was like, get out of here. And I was like, usually they don't look that close.
I know.
I was like, so then once I could finally get with his spouse, I was like, okay, she can't use it anymore.
Right? No, for sure. So kind of like a two-part question, but to wrap it up, what is kind of like a piece of advice that you would give to like a military child, but then also to a military spouse? So it can be like two separate pieces or like one kind of umbrella piece.
Yeah. The military child kid part is hard because, again, you're a kid.
Right.
It's hard because you're still, and this is how I felt when I led high schoolers, is it's like your parents are still your parents.
Yeah.
And like, that's not going to change. And that's can be really hard depending on what that home life looks like for you and how your parents cope with military life is going to really determine your experience. If it's great and you love it, or if it's really, really hard and you don't. And you don't have a lot of control over that. And that is just a reality that I want to like give voice to a military child, is that there is a lot that you don't have control over. And that is a really hard place to be in, even more so than an average kid who is a kid and has parents. Like you change schools and you move and all of that. And that is outside of your parents' control. And that is outside of your control too, which is hard. But I would say giving voice to your emotions as that looks in your household, because every household is very different and how that's vocalized. But I did a lot of journaling as a kid, and I can go back to like deep journals from when my dad was deployed. And I think not suppressing what you're going through, journal it out if you don't feel like you can talk about it with your parents, or find like an adult that you trust, who loves you, who's potentially outside of your family, and like vocalize all that to them. Not everyone's a verbal processor, which I think journaling is helpful for, but that helped me so much. As an adult, I could go back to those feelings I had verbalized and say, oh, okay, this makes sense. Like it just helps put the pieces together when you realize like your childhood, whether military or not, affects how you live as an adult and how you parent and all of that. And so again, just not suppressing, like your feelings are valid and what you're going through is hard. It is so hard and it isn't easy, and it can be isolating too. And so write it down, talk to it with people, like vocalize it, express it as much as needed, because that is so important. And it helps you rewrite the negative thought like patterns that you have of like, oh, my parent doesn't want to be with me because they're deployed. And, like you can just go down these tangents. But when you get them out, you can start to say, okay, that's a very real feeling, but I don't have to live into that. Like, I know that's not true, even though that feels what like is reality right now. So yeah, that's what I'd say to a military kid. And then a spouse, I think, I think this is what I would have liked to have heard, is that like, you have so much control over the family that you want to build within the military. I think we see a lot, like there is a lot modeled out there among military families, and it can feel very overwhelming, and it can feel very hard if the rhetoric is, well, our family is the way it is because of the military. And that can take away a lot of your autonomy, and it can feel very frustrating of like, oh, cool, like this is just going to happen to me because I'm a military spouse. And I felt that when my husband left, I like lost sight of going to grad school. I was like, well, I guess I'm never going to grad school. I guess I'm never doing this type of job. I guess I really spiraled when he first left. And I had to get to a place of saying like, no, my dreams matter. The way I want to raise my family matters. My career goals matter so much. And I had a friend who asked me, she was like, well, what's like your career goal now? And I was like, I don't have any. And she's like, well, maybe
we should find some.
Yeah, maybe that's a problem. And I was like, you're right. Like, I've just gotten in this really depressed headspace of like, oh, because the military has taken away some of my autonomy, I've just given it all of it and been like, right. I'm not going to grad school. I'm not doing X, Y, and Z because of my husband's career. And you can become really jaded to your spouse really fast, and you can start to resent them and resent their choices. And that is not, no one wants to be in that place. Yeah. So I think, finding what you can do for yourself that brings you joy wherever the military takes you is so important. Like you said, fill your cup first. Like what do they say on the planes where it's like, put your oxygen
mask on.
Yes. Yeah. Like if you're not getting oxygen, if you're like not filling up yourself and then overflowing from that to like love and care for your family, your spouse, my in-law, like there's so many things that it's like I think about and people I care about. And if I'm not like investing in myself, then I'm upset at my husband. I'm upset at my parent. Like that all comes from that place of just being discontent with myself. So yeah, I think that's the biggest thing. It's just it's easy to put yourself last as a military spouse because the military doesn't acknowledge you a lot of the time either. They're like, you don't have a spouse. What do you mean? Like I literally got taken off of my husband's OCS paperwork and they stopped paying us BAH for like 2 months.
Oh my gosh.
They were just legitimately like, your wife doesn't exist. Okay. Thanks.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's like you have to make yourself a priority. No one else is going to. And that's so important. So yeah.
No, I love that. And I think, it's both great pieces of advice that, it can make the life easier. It's hard and it sucks, but if you kind of look for those good things, if you journal, if you act like you do exist, then it makes it easier to get through this lifestyle. So thank you so much for being on the podcast and sharing, your journey and what you've been through.
No, thank you. I so appreciate just, you giving voice to all of this. I think there can be a lot of negative information about the military out there. And, people always joke about like the Facebook pages on base and how uplifting they are. But I think it's good to both hear the hard and so that you have an awareness. Like, I think I was almost too prepared for military life. I was like, I wish I came into it a little naive. But also knowing that like there's hope and there's so much joy to be had. Like it's not a life sentence. It's like an adventure and it's awesome. And it can be really awesome as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Thank you for listening to Grace of a Military Child and Life podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to give it a like, follow, and comment. Also, be sure to check out Instagram and Facebook at Grace of a Military Child and Life for more awesome content. For information on the podcast, Military Child Bigs and Littles, GoAMCL blog, or other resources, visit www.goamcl.org. You can also email me at Gracie, that's GRACIE @GOAMCL.org with any questions or comments. To be a guest on the podcast, you can schedule it at www.goamcl.org/schedule a podcast, all one word, or contact me via social media or email. Stay tuned for the next episode where another incredible story is shared.